Okay, thank you very much. As Derek pointed out, it's so great to be with these great, huge public universities like Michigan. They're such exciting places to be, and I love coming to them. In Ann Arbor, if I couldn't live in New York, it's one of these places like Ann Arbor that I just love being in. In thinking about, as Andrew mentioned, we were given questions to reflect on and respond to. I wanted to particularly think about the question that was presented to me: what pedagogical projects can architectural history carry out besides that of narrating architecture's past? And therefore, I decided to think about my presentation as a report from the field, since I've been asked to talk about the Architect's newspaper, which I founded. I originally wanted to talk about something else, but this is what someone thought was more interesting. So I'm the lone voice here on this two-day panel, I think, from the world of architecture publishing. And I'll depart a bit from the academic format of this conference, though of course it's produced some really beautiful, insightful thinking and presentations. And hope you forgive me for a slightly architect-like autobiographical approach of this presentation, as I don't know any other way to present the paper, and the papers, I should say, than to talk about its evolution as a project that grew out of my academic career. I won't theorize about the current state of media and design publications, but rather investigate the position I straddle as a professor at Pratt Institute and as the founder and editor of the Architect's newspaper that I started in 2002. In the late 1990s, I found myself increasingly frustrated by an academic position that's at Pratt, where I was poised between programs of city and regional planning and architecture. One where neither of the two departments wanted to speak to each other about the about their own intersecting interests and concerns about the American city. I'd been hired by Christine Boyer in 1993, who was the chair of the planning program at Pratt Institute, thought that with my degrees in architecture, architectural history, and city planning, that together we could facilitate a conversation between the departments of architecture and city planning. Of course, planning, as you probably know, departments of city planning began in schools of architecture. The first one was at the University of Liverpool, and they stayed there for a long time, although now most planning programs, I don't know what it is at Michigan, but many of the other ones are in public policy institutes. Pratt still has a planning program in the School of Architecture, though nobody talks to each other from these two different programs. So Christine had hoped that I could sort of help facilitate this. It was part of my own interest with all these degrees that I had and my interest in the physical city, even though most of the program in planning was public policy based. Most of the students who came into the program were not at all interested in the physical city. I mean, we don't teach drawing, but not even that. There wasn't really even an interest in engaging with the physical city. It was all about public policy. It was my job at Pratt, my day job, you might say, to teach the history of city planning to graduate planning students and also undergraduate architecture students. I always end up teaching planning to architects and architecture to planning students, so none of them know what I'm talking about. And I like to talk to them about moments where architects and planners had worked together on a dystopia of American cities, like the RPA's Sunnyside Gardens, which I often took them on walking tours to, and Radburn in New Jersey, Lewis Mumford's contribution to the 1932 exhibition on modern architecture, this famous last chapter which caused him so much grief with the Museum of Modern Art, and Catherine Bauer's participation in the 1935 federal housing legislation, the WPA's Greenbelt housing programs, post-World War II urban renewal with their positive and negative aspects, the urban changes brought about by John Lindsay's urban design group, which, given the current gentrification of New York City, is hard to remember how bad things were in New York in the 1960s and 70s, and what creative architects and planners, and also, of course, urban designers. Urban design was the discourse and the profession that filled this vacuum when planning moved over to public policy. And now increasingly, as I think we're all aware, even landscape architects are really getting into the act and engaging with, if not with architects, with the physical city, and planners are continue to write. I hope there's no other planners in here besides myself, but write other papers that nobody else reads, but other planners. So this urban design group was of interest to me, and this also goes all the way back to my own experience, again, here a bit of autobiography, in helping to create People's Park in Berkeley in 1969 as a student in this College of Environmental Design. Anyway, the problem, at least in 1993 when I was hired, and I would say that at least at Pratt, because we've become a total digital kind of architectural program in some respects, particularly on the graduate level, have hardened, those positions have hardened even more between these two departments. And the architect's belief in form, this is digital design, meant that designers find little of interest in public policy positions of city planners. And planners, for their part, believe that the architect's dedication to the transformative power of form and lack of concern for content meant that they were still hopelessly caught up in a belief in utopias rather than the conditions on the ground. Well, I tried for years to branch these two academic positions. Of course, Christine moved off to Princeton and left me foundering in Brooklyn, and I found this incredibly frustrating and powerless as these two sides hardened in their dislike for each other. I took well, let me say I'd taken a sabbatical and moved to London, which still had this very dynamic kind of academic, publishing world that I became engaged in. But I had become an academic in part as part of a post-1968 lifestyle choice. There was going to be no corporate life for this Californian, but also because my experience as an undergraduate student at Berkeley had exposed me to academic historians of various stripes who all had a public outreach component to their academic practices. I studied with that charismatic lecturer, at least for me as a 19-year-old, Spiro Kostoff, with whom I took a summer school class in 1972 to help create the exhibition, The Third Rome, 1870 to 1850, called Traffic and Glory. And this really opened my eyes to the possibilities of exhibition curation, which I've followed as a sort of part of my academic career. And my advisor at that time was Alan Tempko, who of course was not a PhD, but historian, but nevertheless taught some architecture classes, and who was the working journalist and at that time architecture critic for the San Francisco Chronicle. And then also Alan introduced me to the writings of Lewis Mumford, who I realized after a long time, I wrote a thesis on him, an architecture history thesis on him at the University of London, spent much of his life as a historian writing reviews for New York journals and general audience books, things like The Golden Day and The Brown Decades, and really not in academia. And of course, this was probably to his problem for him, because there never developed there are other reasons why there never developed a Mumfordian school of architectural history, but he had no real other contact with academics. But I also studied with the writer of the Vernacular American Landscape, J.B. Jackson, who was an amazing character, who would teach his class on American gas station signs and abandoned roadside architecture in Boston. I think it was at Harvard. One semester, then jump on his motorcycle, ride across the country, stop at his ranch in New Mexico, photographing these gas stations and these petrol pumps all the way along the way, come to Berkeley, teach his class, get back on his motorcycle, and do the same thing back to the East Coast. But as I spoke to him, learned that he was more or less a self-trained historian. I mean, he had a degree from Harvard, but not in history, I think. That is, he became a self-trained historian of landscape. For me, he was a kind of fascinating figure of searcher and iconoclast who could never really be pinned down but what he did. And so he ended up using part of his own family fortune to create Landscape Architecture magazine in 1961, which he remained editor of for many, many years. So these kind of public intellectuals were very appealing to a 1960s era student like myself, who were more concerned with the state of what we would call the inner city, the war in Vietnam, the napalming of the countryside, than arguments about architectural form and style. I would say in parenthesis that many in my generation of post-68 students cared little for becoming architects, choosing instead some vague definition of alternative professional synthesis, and I now consider this a huge mistake on the part of my post-68 generation. For instance, if you ask any Italian architects or intellectuals why that country has lost its way in developing exciting possibilities for the future, and when I was in college, we looked at Superstudio, ArchiZoom, the 1972 New Domestic Landscape Show at MoMA, the Molino Stucchi competition of this 1974 Venice Biennale, and even Strada Novissima, no matter what we think of it, was still filled full of ideas. And why does that not happen anymore in Italy? And they all tell you it's because Tafori told them that it was not possible to transform the city through architecture. They first had to create a social revolution before they created this a kind of real architecture. So, I mean, I don't think Tafori was that well known at Berkeley when I was there, but we still had that same kind of sense that form was somehow not to be trusted and to be suspect. So I came back to Pratt after a sabbatical in London and started the Architects newspaper. I think of it as a pedagogical project, which wants not to be an academic publication, but a professional journal. That was my model. It was something called Building Design, which has been around for about 40 years in the UK, which was an amazing place where academics, professional writers, all sorts of people weighed in on all the issues of the day. And I've tried to keep that as my model for the Architects newspaper as I've been going around. So I bring in these multiple voices. We have editions in the East, based in New York, where we have 18 full-time employees, editors in Los Angeles, who publishes a West Coast paper. I think that's the one that I've passed around. And in the last year in the Midwest. Each of them is a really stupid business model, but they all have their own editorial content. I mean, we should reuse our editorial content, but we don't really do that. There's a couple more of these photos from the 60s. These happen to be from the Venice Biennale that I'm doing some work on, where the students protested the Art Biennale of 1968, and that's what actually began the Architecture Biennale, but it came out of protests, student protests. So I want each of the papers to reflect on the issues and ideas of the places where they're based, and thus we do a good deal of political reporting from an architectural point of view. I heard Jeff Kipnis give this talk about, is the Seattle Public Library a Dutch building because it was designed by Rem Koolhaas, and of course he's arguing for kind of a regional architecture, but I feel very deeply that with the kind of intersection of planning, architecture, zoning, codes, a particular client, a program, that the Seattle Public Library, I would call it a Washington library, a Washington building rather. Do we write operative criticism? Well, I suppose we do. This is something I think about all the time as the editor of the paper, because as a former student activist and architect and trained planner, I've got my own interests that I like to promote. But we do think about what architects want and need to know in their profession. But I think that the pure multiplicity of voices in our publication, as I said, we have 12 full-time employees, scores of writers all over the country and reporters, some of whom write in what is sometimes called synchronic and both diachronic analysis of static events. We offer a whole range of ideas we think are interesting ideas that keep the profession fresh. Well, with what's happening in news content at the moment, with the advent of the internet and the proliferation of blogs, of course, we have a blog, and I can tell you it's a very, very different animal than a print newspaper. The world has changed, but we continue to focus on that world between architecture and urbanism, and there's enough in that space to keep changing the nature of the debate. I like Michel Foucault's idea of an archaeology of knowledge, which is made up of little, not obvious truths arrived at a rigorous method. Both Julie Iovine, who's my executive editor, who has a degree in classics from Yale, and I call this editing, and it is the architecture history that leads us to this space in the field, just as it should be in academia. Thank you.